All right, welcome back to the deep dive. I think for anyone like yourself who spent so much time grappling with these big philosophical questions, there's a question that keeps popping up.
Yeah.
It's like this fascinating puzzle right at the crossroads of like metaphysics and, well, the entire history of how we've come to understand the world, what we call science. And it's about, well, what can Chinese philosophy, with its incredible depth and variety of thought, really tell us about the very nature of science? How did it develop? And the other side of that coin, what can looking at the history of science in China reveal about its philosophical traditions?
It's such fertile ground, because it really challenges those easy assumptions we often walk in with. There's been this, I'd say, dominant narrative, especially in the West, that paints Chinese philosophy, and often it gets boiled down to just Confucianism, right, as somehow disconnected from or even, disinterested in the pursuit of what we now consider science.
That's a really important point because it isn't just a modern misunderstanding, is it? We have some pretty influential thinkers, like Feng Yuan, almost a century ago, making a very deliberate argument along these lines. His 1922 paper, Why China Has No Science, kind of lays it out there, right? And a key takeaway from Feng is that the core values of Chinese philosophy just didn't create the need for a scientific revolution in the same way that happened in Europe.
Exactly. Feng was essentially arguing that the foundation of China's value system, how it's interwoven with those philosophical frameworks, it evolved in ways that didn't really require the kind of systematic empirical investigation that we associate with, say, the scientific revolution in Europe.
Yeah.
And his analysis really zeroed in on two main, often competing tendencies in Chinese philosophical thought.
So from a purely philosophical perspective, what were these two big tendencies that Feng was highlighting?
Well, he called them nature and art, or you could also say human. In his view, you see, a lot of early Chinese philosophy, especially during that incredibly dynamic warring states period, was shaped by this kind of push and pull between these two poles. Taoism, for Feng, represented the extreme of the nature tendency, emphasizing the inherent perfection, the self-sufficiency of the natural order. And in Feng's view, that deep respect for nature, well, it kind of dampened the need to actively investigate and potentially alter it.
So it's more about observing, being in harmony with the natural world rather than trying to manipulate it for human benefit.
Exactly. On the flip side, he saw Mohism as the prime example of this art, or human tendency. And he actually considered the Mohists, with their emphasis on practicality, on bettering human life through very deliberate effort and ingenuity, to be almost scientific in their approach. He points out their focus on logic, their need for precise definitions, and that very practical application of knowledge. They were all about actively shaping the world, not passively accepting it.
That's an interesting way to look at Mohism, especially considering how it developed historically. So where does Confucianism, which was such a dominant force for so much of Chinese intellectual history, fit into this nature versus art framework?
Well, Feng kind of places it as a middle ground, a
Yeah.
sort of compromise between those two extremes. But even within Confucianism, he makes this crucial distinction between, say, Mencius, who leaned more towards that nature side with his ideas about innate goodness, and then Zunzi, who had this much more art-oriented view.
And Zunzi's perspective is really relevant here, isn't it? He has that famous quote where he says, it's better to treat nature as a thing and regulate it than to consider it very great and always think of it. And he goes on, it is better to control nature and use it than to follow and admire it. That's a pretty proactive stance. It sounds almost like, well, what Feng himself pointed out about Bacon and that urge to intervene in the natural world.
It really does. It's a totally different philosophical way of relating to nature compared to many other strains of early Chinese thought. But here's the thing about Feng's argument. He claims that this art, or scientific tendency, this potential for a scientific revolution, basically faded out after the Qin dynasty consolidated power.
And he links this decline to the rise of both Buddhism and then later Neo-Confucianism, saying these traditions kind of shifted the focus inward, more towards cultivating the mind, towards moral self-perfection, and away from that systematic exploration of the world outside ourselves.
Right. That's exactly it. And he goes into this whole discussion about the Neo-Confucian idea of investigating things, wu zi zi zai ge wu, from the Great Learning. The really crucial point, though, for Feng's argument, and for us trying to understand this philosophical divergence, is how this concept of investigating things was actually interpreted. Some early interpretations did lean towards investigating the external world, but the dominant view, the one that really took hold, understood things as referring to the principles within the mind. So the investigation, in a sense, became, introspective, not empirical.
So, at a time when Europe, during the Song Dynasty, was experiencing those early developments that would lead to the scientific revolution, with a focus on understanding and manipulating the material world, Chinese Neo-Confucian thinkers were, in a way, focused on understanding and cultivating the inner landscape of the self. That really gets to the heart of our initial question about how philosophy can shape the direction of inquiry.
It really does. Feng's big idea here is that this philosophical focus on human affairs, on practical ethics, combined with a value system that put personal experience and enjoyment above the pursuit of power through objective knowledge, well, it meant there wasn't a strong need for the kind of rigorous scientific method that developed in the West.
It's definitely a thought-provoking thesis, especially for those of us who are fascinated by philosophy. But as you mentioned at the beginning, it's not the whole story. To really understand the interplay between philosophy and the history of science in China, we have to bring in the work of Joseph Needham.
Absolutely. Needham, a brilliant scientist himself, an embryologist, embarked on this massive project, Science and Civilization in China. And it was groundbreaking. He meticulously documented centuries of scientific and technological innovation in China. His research just blew apart any notion that China had lacked a scientific spirit.
And Needham's work directly contradicts Feng's claim that China had no science, right? He cataloged all these inventions, discoveries, and sophisticated techniques across so many fields, from astronomy and mathematics to engineering and medicine.
He did. But Needham's work also sparked this huge debate, what's often called the Needham problem. If China had this undeniable history of scientific achievement, why didn't it have a scientific revolution like Europe's, with its emphasis on mass and controlled experiments? That question's at the heart of trying to understand why scientific development took such different paths.
It's the big puzzle, isn't it? And while Needham explored all these different social, economic, and institutional factors to try and answer it, Feng's argument offers this distinctly philosophical explanation for the divergence, one that's rooted in the fundamental values and intellectual orientations of Chinese thought.
Exactly. And while Needham, in his later writings on Chinese philosophy, acknowledged Feng's work, he seems to have largely bypassed that 1922 thesis about the absence of science in China. Needham's approach was very universalist, aiming to demonstrate how China's achievements fit into this global narrative of scientific progress, showing just how much China contributed to human knowledge.
A worthy goal, for sure, especially given how Eurocentric the history of science has often been. But this universalist approach has also been criticized, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Some historians of science argue that by using modern Western categories of science to analyze historical Chinese practices, well, we're imposing our own framework and missing the unique aspects of how knowledge was created in China. Nathan Sivin, for example, has argued that the Chinese didn't have one unified concept of science like we do today. Instead, they focused on these distinct, specialized disciplines.
And Sivin's categorization of Chinese knowledge into quantitative and qualitative sciences is really helpful for understanding the relationship between these fields in philosophy, isn't it?
Absolutely. He identifies fields like mathematics, Swan, mathematical harmonics or acoustics, Lu, and mathematical astronomy, like Li, as the quantitative ones. And then on the qualitative side, we have astronomy, astrology, Tian Qi, medicine, yeah, especially that concept of nurturing life, Yangsheng, which has all these philosophical layers and even practices like feng shui or sighting. And it seems like these qualitative sciences, the ones focused on interpretation and those big picture frameworks, those are where we see the most influence from philosophical ideas.
It makes sense, right? Tianwen, with its connection to political legitimacy through interpreting celestial omens, and Yangshen, with its roots in self-cultivation and cosmic harmony, those would naturally overlap with philosophical concerns. And this brings us to another important part of this discussion, the relationship between Chinese science and Taoism, a connection that Needham himself emphasized.
Right. Needham famously described Taoism as having not just religious and poetic aspects, but also magical, scientific, democratic, and politically revolutionary ones. Yeah. He saw Taoist philosophy as a driving force behind many scientific and medical advancements in China, especially with its focus on nature.
But while Needham's enthusiasm for that link is understandable, later scholarship has taken a more nuanced view, hasn't it? And one of the challenges lies in how nature itself was understood in early China. As scholars like Jeffrey Lloyd, Nathan Sivin, and Dirk Boat have pointed out, it wasn't this simple monolithic concept. Boat actually identified a whole spectrum of pre-modern Chinese attitudes towards nature, ranging from the idea of conquering it to deep reverence for its order.
Exactly. And Bode also highlighted other factors in Chinese society that might have influenced the development of science. the complexities of the written language, differing ideas about space and time, the influence of the imperial system, and its conservative elites. And really important for our discussion about philosophy is that we can't just oversimplify things by calling all Chinese science Taoist. Sivan has made this important distinction between popular religion, organized Taoist movements, and Taoist philosophical thought. He argues that a lot of the technical expertise in early China came from popular, often artisanal traditions, not just from Taoist schools.
Which makes sense because just because someone practicing Taoism might have used a particular technical skill, say in alchemy or medicine, doesn't mean that the skill itself came directly from Taoist philosophy.
Exactly. And while some Taoist figures definitely engaged with and sometimes even advanced existing knowledge, their main goals weren't always the same as the kind of rational inquiry and systematic experimentation that we often associate with modern science. Plus, the fact that a lot of early scientific records ended up in the Taoist canon doesn't automatically make that knowledge inherently Taoist. Over time, Taoist institutions became major repositories for written material, including stuff from people and traditions outside of Taoism.
So we have to be careful not to assume a direct philosophical link just because of where texts were kept. And this really starts to reveal a more complex picture of how philosophy and those early forms of scientific inquiry interacted in China. It wasn't just one tradition being pro-science and another indifferent.
It wasn't. To really get it, we need to look at the shared intellectual environment where both philosophy and what we'd call early science came from. And it seems the origins of Chinese science lie in this blend of ideas from those masters textualists, the philosophers, and the technical experts, those skilled in what they called numbers and techniques, shu, and recipes and methods, fengji. And of course, you can't forget the influence of Ru ideas, what we often translate as Confucian, along with those big cosmological concepts like yin-yang and the five agents.
And it's those core concepts that seem to have been the foundation for so much of early Chinese thought, influencing both the philosophical and what we'd now call proto-scientific areas.
They were. Fundamental ideas like qi, that vital energy that's believed to permeate everything and is always changing to yin-yang and the five agents, were crucial for how they explain both the universe and things like the human body. Yin-yang cosmology, especially as you see it in the Yi Jing, Book of Changes, and the whole idea of correlative cosmology, that interconnectedness between heaven, earth, and humanity, all reflecting a shared order. They were the big frameworks for understanding the world in both philosophical and practical ways. Even the concept of a classic, or canon, as a source of knowledge that was shared across philosophical and technical traditions. You see it in texts like the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine and the mathematical Zhu Bi Suan Jing. And, recent discoveries of older texts suggest that even these classics themselves drew on much older lost traditions.
It's amazing how these core ideas were like a common language, a set of shared assumptions, even if philosophers and these technical specialists use them in different ways. And this shared intellectual heritage makes it even more interesting to see how those fields diverged later on, especially for us coming from a philosophical perspective.
And that divergence really becomes clear when you look at how knowledge was categorized and valued in early texts, like the Han Shu, History of the Former Han Dynasty, bibliographic treatise. It's basically an ancient library catalog that divides all known written knowledge into 6 sections. And the way it's organized, well, it shows this perceived split between what they consider generalist and specialist types of knowledge.
Right, you have the 6 arts or classics, the foundational texts of Confucian education, then the master's texts from all those different schools of philosophy, and poetry, representing high-level literary expression. Those are the first 3. And they all seem to have a generalist, humanistic focus. And then the last 3 sections cover military works, numbers and techniques, and recipes and methods, all areas we'd mostly call specialized, practical, or technical knowledge today.
Exactly. The numbers and techniques, Shu section, included fields like astronomy, cosmology, calendars, five agents theory as it was used for divination, and all sorts of other ways of predicting the future. And the recipes and methods, Feng-Ji section, dealt with medicine, ways to live longer, practices for sexual health, and even how to achieve immortality, which shows the wide range of interests of those Feng-Shi, the recipe masters, who were often connected to the Han court.
One thing that's really striking when you think about intellectual history is how differently these texts survived. We have way more works from the generalist sections, the classics, the philosophical masters, and poetry than we do from those specialist sections, especially numbers and techniques and recipes and methods. We've lost a lot of those.
That's a key point. And it's even more obvious when you look at who compiled those sections of the treatise.
Hmm.
Lu Sheng, a well-known scholar associated with that broader classical learning, was in charge of the first three sections. But the last three were put together by technical experts in those specific fields, like Yin Qian, an official astronomer who did the numbers and techniques section.
So this difference in authorship, plus the fact that so many of the specialist texts were lost, suggests that there was a kind of intellectual hierarchy, doesn't it? An implicit value placed on that generalist, philosophical, and literary knowledge over the more specialized technical stuff, which ties back to what Feng was saying about those philosophical priorities.
It does. And this preference reflects this long-running intellectual debate, going all the way back to the Warring States period, about whether it's better to have a broad, adaptable intellect based on philosophical principles or specific technical skills. Thinkers from all different schools like Zhuangzi, Zunzi, and Han Fei, they all wrestled with this to some extent, often arguing that true wisdom comes from understanding those fundamental principles, the way. And the way the Han Shu bibliographic treatise is structured, well, it seems to back up that viewpoint.
So not only was there this division in the types of intellectual work people did, but there was also this dynamic socially and intellectually where these philosophical elites and technical experts, even though they drew from some shared cosmological ideas, were kind of in competition for recognition, patronage, and social status.
Exactly. Scholar Michael Puett, for example, has argued that the way philosophical texts were interpreted and made into official canons during the Han Dynasty was partly a reaction to the growing influence of the Fangxi and the power they claimed through their specialized knowledge. This whole dynamic probably contributed to how these two intellectual communities developed those philosophical literary elites on one side and the more practical technical experts on the other.
So the social context of the people doing these different types of inquiry, that seems really important for understanding how philosophy and early science related to each other. The master's textualists were often independent scholars trying to gain influence through their intellectual ideas, whereas the astronomers, for example, were generally part of the government bureaucracy.
That's a crucial difference. But then you also have these fascinating figures like Zhu Yan, who was linked to the Yin Yang School and the famous Jixi Academy. He seems to have bridged that gap. Sima Qian, in the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, describes Zhu Yan as being deeply involved in studying natural phenomena. He combined classical learning with direct observation. And the Jixi Academy itself was this incredible place, this hotbed of intellectual activity that brought together all sorts of thinkers, including people we might think of today as both philosophers and early scientists.
And then there's the Fengxi, those recipe masters, who seem like this intriguing mix of medical knowledge, divination, and technical skills. They had a lot of influence, especially during the Han Dynasty, and they used a lot of yin-yang and five agents cosmology. And their practices actually have roots in earlier philosophical traditions, too.
They do. Their focus was often more on the practical side, but you can see the philosophical connections. Texts like the Zhuangzi and the Inner Cultivation Neya chapter of the Guanzi, they both have ideas that seem to be predecessors to some Fangxi practices. So while there was some overlap in shared heritage, the practices and the main texts of the master's textualists and the Fangxi, and by extension, those more formal philosophical inquiries and these early scientific endeavors, they mostly followed different paths.
So when we look at the early sciences themselves, cosmology, astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine, how did these interactions with philosophy actually play out? Let's focus on those qualitative sciences where philosophy seems to have had the biggest impact.
Sounds good. Let's start with cosmology and Tian when observing and interpreting what's happening in the heavens. This has incredibly deep roots in Chinese culture, going all the way back to Neolithic times. Now, Sivan makes this distinction between the quantitative aspects of astronomy, aiming for precise measurement and prediction, and those qualitative interpretations of astrological signs for political and social reasons. But it seems that philosophers didn't really engage much with the technical side of celestial mechanics. While astronomy and astrology were hugely important for things like court ritual and legitimizing imperial power, philosophers generally didn't get too deep into those mathematical models or observational techniques.
What about mathematics, Xuan? Was there more interaction with philosophy in that area?
There were definitely some connections, and there's this ongoing scholarly discussion, a really fascinating one, about the concept of mathematical proof and how it worked in early China. Scholars like Corinne Chemla and Guo Shuchun have done some really important work on this. But it seems like that direct, systematic philosophical inquiry into the Nature and foundations of math that you see in some other traditions might not have been as central in the Chinese context.
But when you look at Han Dynasty astronomy and cosmology, you see the Fangxian really wrestling with those big questions about the heavens. They were developing those complex systems for divination based on celestial events and things happening in the atmosphere.
Exactly. And texts from that period, like the Huainanzi, which is this fascinating mix of Han Dynasty thought, show a clear interest in cosmological ideas and even early attempts at physical measurement, like those stories about the sage Emperor Yu trying to survey and map the boundaries of the Earth. There's this detailed passage in the Huainanzi about using gnomons, those vertical rods, to figure out directions and measure distances by looking at shadows. It's a good example of that practical, observation-based inquiry that combines understanding of the cosmos with basic measurement techniques. The text actually says, erecting the two gnomons and observing their shadows at noon, the longer shadow is to the west and the shorter shadow is to the east. The distance between the ends of their noon shadows is the east-west length.
And the Mornanzi is also famous for those detailed monthly ordinance Yuling calendars. It meticulously connects celestial movements and those five agents' correlations to regulate, well, basically everything: social life, rituals, agriculture. It really shows how pervasive that idea of correlative cosmology was.
It does. These monthly ordinances, you also see them in the Guanzi and the Lushi Chongqi. They weren't just about tracking seasons and farming. They laid out the proper rituals, social behaviors, even dietary recommendations based on these perceived links between the human world and those cyclical patterns in the cosmos, all filtered through the lens of yin-yang and the five agents. They even incorporated the 28 lunar lodges, those star groups, along the path the sun takes, connecting them to the months. And a lot of times, these calendars also included the stem branch sexagenary cycle, a way of recording days and years, sometimes with notes about which days were lucky or unlucky for certain activities. It really shows how intertwined cosmic order and human life were in early Chinese thought. Seven pointed out that the fact that there wasn't a separate word for nature, as distinct from human affairs, before the 19th century tells us a lot about this worldview. Cosmic order was seen as reflecting and influencing political stability and social harmony. And that led to all these intricate cosmologies based on yin-yang and the five agents, which you see developed in those key medical texts, like the Huangdi Neijing, Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, and other Han Dynasty writings.
And that brings us to medicine, and especially the concept of yang sheng, nurturing life, which seems to be one of the best examples of how philosophical ideas mixed with those early scientific and therapeutic practices.
Definitely. Yang Sheng was a big part of Fangxi medical practices. It included all kinds of self-cultivation techniques meant to improve health, help people live longer, and even achieve immortality. You find hints of these ideas in some of those earlier masters' texts, too, like Menshi is talking about cultivating a flood-like qi, and this Wangzi's chapter, The Lord of Nurturing Life. Although the focus might be a little different from what you see in those later Fangxi recipes in the Han Shu, which are more about physical health and extending lifespan. But where you really see this integration of yang-yang, qi, and the five agents as basic principles for understanding the human body is in those medical theories, especially the ones in the Huangdi Neijing. For example, the Huangdi Neijing Ling Shu lays out these detailed connections between different parts of the body and the structure of the cosmos, showing that deep interconnectedness.
It's amazing how those big philosophical concepts provided a framework for understanding how the body works and what goes wrong with it. And even ideas about gender in medicine were shaped by these concepts, right?
They were. Applying yin-yang theory extended to understanding differences between male and female bodies, which scholars like Firth, Lisa Rafals, and Robin Yates have written about. You have concepts like the androgynous yellow emperor's body, and using yin-yang, heaven-earth, and right-left as metaphors for male and female physiology. You see this in texts like the Huangdi Neijing Suen, which describes how men and women have opposite pulse patterns, for instance. And these theoretical frameworks then influenced how they treated people.
So those ideas about yin-yang, qi, and the five agents, those weren't just abstract philosophy. They were put into practice. They guided how they diagnosed and treated diseases using things like akumaxa acupuncture and moxibustion and herbal medicine. And they were central to all those practices for longevity, trying to harmonize the individual with that larger cosmic order.
Exactly. And it's also worth pointing out just how many Taoist thinkers throughout Chinese history were also important doctors and wrote key medical texts. It really shows that complex, multi-layered relationship between philosophical and early scientific thinking during this time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's pretty clear that the relationship between Chinese philosophy and early science is way more complicated than just saying Chinese philosophy was anti-science.
Absolutely. Needham's work showed just how much China contributed to science and technology. And Feng Yulan made us think critically about how philosophical priorities might have influenced the path science took. But the reality is much more nuanced. While those main schools of what we call Confucianism might have often focused more on human ethics and government than on systematically investigating the natural world, those early interactions, especially in how they shaped the conceptual frameworks and practices of those qualitative sciences like medicine and cosmology, were really important.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? With this shared history and those common intellectual roots of philosophy and science in early China, what would happen if we took a more integrated approach to these fields today? How would that affect how we understand both the natural world and the human condition? Maybe by appreciating those different ways of asking questions and understanding things, we can get a much richer, a more complete picture of those fundamental questions that continue to drive us.
That's a great point. It definitely challenges us to reconsider those rigid boundaries we've set up between disciplines in the modern world, and to appreciate all the different interconnected ways that humans have tried to understand both ourselves and the universe we live in.